Hello and thank you for joining us. You're listening to On Israel. This is Caspit from Tel Aviv. It took only 24 hours to put an end to months of speculation and assumptions about the Biden administration's expected foreign policy, and to answer the question of whether Joe Biden is more of an Obama than a Clinton. On Friday, the 26th of February, the Biden administration released an intelligence report blaming the Saudi crown prince for ordering the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. On Thursday, the 25th, the Biden administration ordered a military strike on Iranian targets in Syria. The administration is engaged in a careful balancing act. On the one hand, a conciliatory approach to the Arab world. On the other hand, an emphasis on human rights. On one hand, a desire to resume talks with Iran. On the other hand, a more militant approach that seeks to create credible deterrence in the Persian Gulf, probably the world's most volatile region these days. Biden's latest actions were designed to signal both Tehran and Riyadh. While they may reflect initial attempts by a new administration to feel its way within such a polarized arena, they have turned the Middle East into a bundle of nerves. In Riyadh, tensions are running high as disappointment and concern mount. Tehran has responded by increasing its demands for agreeing to negotiations with the Americans and Europeans. In Jerusalem, sentiments alternate between anxiety and anger. Asked in an interview last week whether he trusts President Biden on the Iran issue, Prime Minister Netanyahu answered that he mostly trusts himself. Our guest today is one of the most foremost experts on relations between Washington and the Middle East. He has written for most Israeli media outlets, including the Jerusalem Post, Ma'ariv, Yediot Achronot, and Haaretz. He served as policy advisor to 3 Israeli foreign ministers and as Israeli consul general in New York. Alon Pinkas, one of the most knowledgeable authorities on Israeli-US relations and Israel ties with the Democratic Party, join us right after this short break.
If you're listening to this podcast, you obviously care about the Middle East, and if you do, you should probably be reading Al Monitor. Al Monitor is a global newsroom headquartered in Washington, D.C., with a network of over 160 contributors around the world. Al Monitor offers first-class reporting and analysis from a range of perspectives and an approach that represents the highest journalistic standards, as well as an award-winning commitment to press freedom and independence. If you haven't done so already, visit us at almonitor.com, check out our articles, and sign up for our free newsletters. There's a lot to choose from, including the Week in Review, an essay that offers unusual insights and forecasts into the region based upon Al Monitor's outstanding reporting. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe to our Al Monitor podcast on your favorite podcast platform, On Israel with Ben Caspit, and On the Middle East with me, Andrew Parasolidi.
Now we say shalom to Alon Pinkas. Welcome to our Own Israel podcast. Hi, Alon. How are you?
Hi, Ben. Good to be with you.
Let's start with the latest developments. The lights in the palace in Riyadh and in the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem have been burning late since the Americans issued the report that holds MBS responsible for the Khashoggi assassination. How do you explain the timing of the publication? After all, the report has been ready for months.
Yes. Well, it's not only has the report been ready for months, but most of it is based on intelligence that Turkey revealed about a year and a half ago. So there's nothing new in terms of the evidence. But, and this is a big but, for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the ODNI, to issue a report that begins with the words "we assess," not "we have confidence," not "we believe," not based on the intelligence we gathered, but "we assess," is a very serious issue. Now, while the evidence against Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, is not new or is not exactly an indictment, this is a very important document in terms of the timing, as you referred to in your question. And the timing, I think, has to do more than anything with two things. The ongoing negotiations or the drafting of policy in Washington about how the U.S. and in what sequence the U.S. will re-enter the JCPOA, also known as the Iran nuclear deal. And I think that this report suppresses or at least restrains and quiets down Saudi opposition to it. And secondly, it's a balancing act on a very, very tenuous relationship that exists in the last several years between the U.S. and the Saudis. It began in the late Bush administration, went on for 8 years under Obama. There was a change under Trump, but now with Biden, it's back to the reassessment, or as he calls it, recalibration. I think this is a clear message to the Saudis that the reality of the relationship and the contents of the relationship as you think you know it no longer exist. We need to recalibrate this, quote unquote. And so in that respect, I think the timing is critical. Also, MBS himself is in a hospital. He had an appendicitis removal operation. And Biden, ahead of the publication of the report, called King Salman of Saudi Arabia, and according to American reports, insisted that MBS not be on the phone call. So I think that in terms of his own political fortunes, while the Americans did not impose a travel restriction or deny him a future visa, I think they're out to weaken him significantly.
The greatest nightmare in Israel, not only in Israel, maybe also in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the Gulf, and elsewhere, is a return to the Obama-era policy that placed a premium on human rights and political correctness. As far as Israel and its Sunni Muslim allies are concerned, such policy has no place in the chaotic deserts of the Middle East. How do you see Biden's policy in this regard?
Okay. Jamal Khashoggi was not just another Arab whose human rights were deprived and was assassinated because someone didn't like him. Jamal Khashoggi was a journalist for the Washington Post that is owned by Jeff Bezos, who also owns Amazon. The Saudis then threatened, after assassinating Khashoggi, they also threatened Bezos, allegedly tapped or hacked his phone, threatened a boycott of Amazon, which employs over 1 million employees in the US. This is not something that has to do with a return to a human rights-based, or as you said correctly, putting a premium on a human rights-based foreign policy, but more so it is individually directed at MBS. And I'm going to repeat what I said a few moments ago and tell the Saudis, gentlemen, with all due respect, you got this strategic equation wrong and upside down. You need us, we don't need you. This myth that you could do whatever you want because we need you to counter or confront Iran is wrong. You need us to confront Iran. What you've been doing in Yemen is inexcusable. It's got nothing to do with human rights. It's got everything to do with foreign policy stupidity. And there is an apprehension or an anxiety in the US that, by the way, that existed in the Trump administration too, but Biden is not inventing anything we didn't hear about. There is an anxiety that the Saudis will try to drag the US into another war in the Middle East, obviously against Iran. I don't see that happening, but I understand where this is coming from. I've heard this a few times myself from members of Congress, from people who used to work at the State Department or the Pentagon. And so I don't think this is a return to Obama-era policies. I think this is just a reassessment of the relationship with the Saudis, who really got on American nerves in the last few years.
Alon, let's try to get into Benjamin Netanyahu's head, and you know the guy. You've been once. You've been
not as well as you do.
Yes, we share the same knowledge, I think. But he thinks about this MBS, which is Israel's maybe most important ally in the Middle East right now. A very strong ally confronting Iran, the nuclear threat, the new relationship, the strategic, the Abraham Accords, etc., etc. He also met him. And suddenly his biggest allies in Washington are marking MBS because, an incident that occurred a few years ago, and it's not very, it's a bad incident, but is this a reason to throw him under the bus, like we used to say?
No, not at all. Look, in and of itself, it's a very nasty incident. But the Americans also believe in realpolitik, as they call it in German. They know where their allies are and they know what they need to do. And what they're doing is balancing an equation that was tilting pro-Saudi. The Saudis get involved in Yemen and drag the Americans. The Saudis threaten Iran and drag the Americans. The Saudis get into a bar brawl, a stupid fist fight in a bar with Qatar. And they're asking for America's help. Someone in America, at least in this administration, has grown tired. Now, in terms of Mr. Netanyahu, yes, you're right. But if Mr. Netanyahu is honest with himself and thinks straight, he knows that Saudi Arabia's contribution to confronting Iran is less than optimal. Not because they don't want to, but because they cannot. And what they can do is all based on American technology. And so Mr. Netanyahu is going to have to reforge or rekindle this relationship with MDS with 1.5 eyes looking at how people react to it in Washington in the event that Mr. Netanyahu remains prime minister after the March elections. I don't know that. I don't know otherwise. I'm just saying we don't know. But assuming he remains...
No one knows it right now.
Right. Assuming he remains prime minister for the sake of our conversation, anything he does with the Saudis has to be done with full transparency with the Americans. And this is a very hard task for Mr. Netanyahu to accomplish, given that his standing in this new administration is not the best, to say the least.
To close this Saudi issue, I'll ask you one more question. The Saudis are clearly expecting Israel to shield them from certain aspects of the new White House policy, as you just described it. But can Netanyahu, in your opinion, deliver such cover now that Trump is no longer there?
No, I think that even under Trump, he could not deliver. I mean, Trump's relationship with the Saudis, or Jared Kushner's relationship with MBS, with Mohammed bin Salman, was transactional. It was arms deals for regional stability. You may like it, you may dislike it, but it wasn't a real alliance. What you have now in Washington is a Democrat in the White House, and at least for the next 2 years, Democrats control the Senate, Democrats control the House of Representatives. And MBS has just been blemished by this report. I fail to see how Mr. Netanyahu, somewhat unpopular in all three branches, the White House, the House, and branches of the executive, the House and the Senate, I fail to see how he can deliver. He lost all his levers of power. There was a time back in the 90s, as you remember, when Clinton was president and Newt Gingrich was Speaker of the House of Representatives. And again, after 2008, when Mr. Obama was president, and John Boehner was the Republican Speaker of the House, where Netanyahu could play games in Washington the way he likes. He always almost invariably lost, but he liked to play the game. Right now, he doesn't have the opportunity to play that game because he can go to Republicans and risk further alienating himself from the administration. Yes, he can go to Republicans in the Senate and the House and risk Israel even deeper becoming a wedge issue between the two parties, something that all prime ministers before him were very, very sensitive and aware not to do. I fail to see how he can promise anything to the Saudis.
Maybe we can summarize this issue as saying the rules of the game were changed. There is a new sheriff in town, and you all have to cope with it. Netanyahu was asked in an interview.
I'll remind you of what Vice President Spiro Agnew said. The bastards changed the rules, and no one told me.
No one told me. Netanyahu Alon was asked in an interview last week in Israel whether he trusts President Biden. He answered that he trusts himself. What do you make of this ambiguity? It was also reflected in the fact that President Biden waited 4 weeks before making his first phone call to Netanyahu, although Netanyahu was the first Middle East leader that got the call.
Yeah, but I think that Mr. Netanyahu doesn't think of himself as a local regional leader. He thinks of himself much more than that.
Of course.
Which leads us to, in my mind, a very silly question. When a prime minister of Israel is being asked, do you trust the president of the United States? He should say immediately, yes, I absolutely trust the president of the United States. That doesn't mean that I may not disagree with him. That doesn't mean that I don't need to confront him. Hopefully not, but that could happen. But do I trust him? Absolutely. Specifically, if we're talking about someone like Joe Biden, who has an impeccable record of pro-Israeli actions, statements, and votes in 36 years in the Senate and 8 years as a vice president. This was Mr. Netanyahu's narcissistic side talking, not his geopolitical or strategic thinking.
Yes, and we all hope we not pay a price for this, because it will be paid from our pocket. I want to ask you in a different issue. We're going into the Iranian nuclear program now. You signed a document issued last week by an organization called Commanders for a Secure Israel that urged Netanyahu to cooperate with the new administration on an improved nuclear deal.
Yes.
With Iran. Netanyahu, meanwhile, has added two former national security advisors to his team, Amidror and Nagel. Both are defense hawks, and like the prime minister, they reject any nuclear agreement with Iran. How do you see this potential clash?
Obviously, Mr. Netanyahu had another option. He could have appointed the head of the Mossad, Yossi Cohen, and for his own reasons, chose not to. Mr. Amidror is an expert on Iran. Mr. Nagel is not an expert on Iran. So I don't know what the what exactly the good cop, bad cop routine is going to take shape here. Mr. Netanyahu, if you recall, and I'm sure you do, Ben, you wrote a lengthy and important book about Netanyahu. Mr. Netanyahu had the opportunity in 2013, again in 2014, and most definitely in very early 2015 to somehow influence the shaping and the wording of the original JCPOA. The crucial year was 2014, where he chose to confront Obama on a whole host of issues having nothing to do with Iran, expanding settlements, building freezes, and so on. He had the opportunity, he was offered a much bigger defense deal with the US, which in the end was $38 billion over 10 years, reminding our listeners that the vice president at the time was Joe Biden. And I think that Mr. Netanyahu is very close to making that same mistake again. He has an opportunity now to work discreetly and quietly with the administration, to say what he doesn't like, to contribute what he thinks needs to be done. Some of Mr. Netanyahu's reservations in 2014 and 2015 about the JCPOA were absolutely right and correct. But instead of trying to influence how they are being written inside the room, he chose to stand out the room and scream and shout and put on a grandstanding show. I hope he doesn't do that again. And by appointing Mr. Amidror and Mr. Nagel, although these two gentlemen are very soft-spoken relatively, so I don't know how much noise this is going to make, but the signal it sends to the administration is, we're dead fast against this. Now convince us. the administration could come up with their own ingenious conclusion. We don't need to convince you of anything. Fact is that the agreement, however imperfect, curbed Iran's nuclear program. Since the US unilaterally withdrew, Iran has times 12 the amount of enriched uranium. So I don't need Mr. Nagel, I being the US, not me. We don't need the Mr. Nagel or Mr. Amidro or Mr. Netanyahu himself, for that matter, to tell us what needs to be done. Again, let me stress this, Ben. Netanyahu could have, after the unpleasant episode of the call that didn't arrive, after the call had arrived, Mr. Netanyahu can invite himself to DC after the election. He could initiate a series of 2-3 phone calls between now and March 23rd and ask to speak to the president, speak to Secretary Blinken, speak to the head of the CIA, the Secretary of Defense, Floyd Austin, and even Rob Malley, the US presidential envoy on Iran. Instead, he's sending all kinds of proxies to say how unhappy he is. I don't know that this is good diplomacy.
It's not only this. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, when Trump was in the Oval Office, Netanyahu said a few times about the agreement, the nuclear agreement, fix it or nix it. Now he's not saying fix it anymore. He was quoted last week as saying or thinking or in close circuit saying, no deal with Iran. Don't go back to any deal with Iran. I think he's more hawkish now than he was.
He's more hawkish because of the election. You know that Iran for him is an election instrument and prop. I don't question his belief that Iran presents a clear danger, but I think that he's using or abusing the issue of Iran for his own political purposes. But let me go back to what you just said. So here's the thing. Netanyahu, in March of 2015, does something that no Israeli prime minister dared to do before him, goes behind the President Obama and Vice President Biden's back to speak to Congress against the deal. In his speech in March of 2015, he says, and I'm quoting from memory, so I may be wrong in a word or two, I've been told that it's either disagreement or war. I'm saying you're wrong. There is a better agreement, quote unquote. Later, he said, as you correctly quoted him as saying, fix it or nix it. So here's the thing. He never presented a better deal, although he had ample time to do so. He never offered how to nix it. How to fix it. And now he has an opportunity to fix it. Supposedly, Trump withdrew unilaterally. Trump failed to offer anything instead of the agreement as a substitute policy or an alternative agreement. So now Netanyahu was actually handed the opportunity to tell the Americans what he thinks needs to be done. Instead, he's sending, or may not send, didn't send, I don't know, you may know, the chief of staff of the IDF, Lieutenant General Aviv Kochavi, to threaten the US about how bad the agreement is without knowing yet what the Americans intend to do. By the way, parenthetically, because they don't know yet. And so I honestly don't know what this fix it or nix it or better agreement mean. One more thing, Ben. About 10 days ago, there was a story that no one paid attention to for some reason, in which Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, right? Yeah. Writes in his Twitter account that 2 or 3 months after Trump withdrew from the agreement in 2018, May 2018, Khamenei, spoke to the French president, Emmanuel Macron, and Macron told him that Trump had told him the day before that if the Iranians are willing just to add one sentence to the agreement saying that we will discuss missile development and regional policies at a later date, he will return to the agreement immediately. Now, the Iranians did not accept, according to Khamenei, he rejected the offer. look, had they accepted the offer and Trump went back to the agreement, Mr. Netanyahu could have been presented with a much harsher reality than he is now.
I wanted now to ask you, how do you see the relationship with Washington playing out after having said all that? But I'm asking myself and you, Mr. Netanyahu is very smart, very experienced, very intelligent. He knows exactly the price he and the state of Israel paid for the mistakes he made in 2015. You just described it. He know that he could not get into the room and affect the negotiation. And right now, instead of learning something from his mistakes, he still is preferring to stand outside the room and shout and yell on everyone. Yeah. And is it really all because of the election that for Netanyahu, it is an existential threat that March 23rd election can bring the end of the political career of Netanyahu, and then you have the trial, etc. So everything is politics?
Yeah, it is. You know that better than anyone. It's all politics. It's all survival for him. Look, I honestly think he hates Democrats and hates American liberals and hates the progressive Jews and dislikes many in the Democratic congressional leadership. I believe him when he says he doesn't like them, or when he thinks, or what I think he thinks, he doesn't like them. I also believe that in his, deep down, he's always been much more sympathetic. And I think he admitted that to you, to me, publicly many times. He's much more sympathetic to the Republican Party, except for two things that we must mention. The Republican Party that he has been affiliated with is not the Republican Party of today. The neoconservatives, the Newt Gingrich, the Bob Dole, the George H.W. Bush, the George Bush, these people are no longer in the Republican Party. The Republican Party now is a party that I just cannot see why Netanyahu in the world would be affiliated and connected to. Which leads me to the second thing. With ideology and sympathy aside, he's the prime minister of the state of Israel. I expect him to make smart decisions. It took decades of a lot of hard work to keep Israel out of the American political discourse. We call it bipartisanship. Bipartisanship doesn't mean that both parties love you the same. It means that you, Israel, is not a wedge issue. It's not a dividing issue between the parties. And decades of diplomats and politicians and defense ministry officials in Israel have worked to maintain that. Even when there was friction and confrontation between an Israeli prime minister and an American president, it was never because of party affiliation in the US or political preference. It was always substance and sometimes a personality clash. What Mr. Netanyahu has been doing for the better part of the last 5 years is forcing Israel to become a partisan issue in America. He's forcing Republicans, some of which are white supremacists and nationalists, to support Israel, even though they don't care much about Israel. And then forcing Democrats, Jews among them, to distance themselves from Israel. I just fail to see how that would produce a smart policy or a smart result.
By the way, finally, when you were talking about the Republican Party and mentioned a few names, I think one of our colleagues, maybe Chaim Levinson in Haaretz today or yesterday, mentioned that the same process happened to Likud in Israel.
Yes, he did. I read it today. Yes, he did.
Right?
Yeah. It's become a cult. The Republican Party has become a cult. It lost its liberal and moderate wing of the Republican Party. And the same thing happened with all due differences of political systems and personalities, but the same process happened here to the Likud movement. From a basically right-wing, but essentially liberal, national liberal movement, it's become a Netanyahu cult. That if you take him out, it's an extreme right-wing party. Everyone who is either a moderate on the left-right spectrum, or a liberal on the liberal conservative spectrum, left Likud.
So actually, where the political fight in Israel and the United States is less left against right and more liberals against conservatives.
Absolutely. Look, that is why I feel much more comfortable with a guy like Avigdor Lieberman, who until a few years ago was right-wing, and I would never consider voting for him, although you and I know that, you and I both like him personally. But Avigdor Lieberman, and for that matter, Gideon Saar, two people who I have very little in common with on the left-right spectrum. I have 90% things in common with them now, because the left-right spectrum is no longer valid. It's pro-democracy, anti-democracy, liberal or not liberal.
And this is the only game in town. Consul General Alon Pinkas, it was very interesting. I thank you very much for joining us, and we'll get to one very short break. We'll be back here with some final thoughts. Thank you, Alon, and see you.
Thank you, Ben.
I'm Andrew Parasolidi, president of the award-winning media news site El Monitor, where we cover the Middle East with some of the best reporters and columnists anywhere. And I'm excited to announce our new podcast, On the Middle East, where each week I will interview newsmakers from the U.S. and the region about the latest news and trends, with additional commentary from our on-the-ground correspondents. Those of you who follow the region know that what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. And to cite another great movie line, every time the U.S. tries to get out, the region pulls us back. Your time is valuable, so let me promise you this. You will learn something, and you will never be bored, because each week we'll be talking with and listening to those leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in this critical and fascinating region. So please subscribe to On the Middle East with me, Andrew Parasolidi.
Thank you for staying with us. Ambassador Alon Pinkas says that the main reason for the Washington's surprising doubleheader in the last 2 days, I'm talking about posting the intelligence report regarding the Khashoggi assassination and simultaneously striking Iranian target in Syria, is simple. Making sure both sides, Tehran and Riyadh, and maybe even Jerusalem, fully understand that there is a totally new ballgame with totally new rules and a new sheriff in town. Pinkas criticized Prime Minister Netanyahu's remark in an interview last week in Israel when he was asked if he trusts President Biden, and answered that he trusts mainly himself. Every responsible Israeli leader, when asked this question, says Pinkas, have to answer only one simple answer. I may have disagreements from time to time with the president, but I absolutely and fully trust him as a true friend and ally of the State of Israel. The Netanyahu answer, according to Pinkas, was either political or narcissistic. I hope you enjoyed it. See you here next Monday in On Israel. I am Ben Caspit from Tel Aviv. Take care. Be safe. Bye-bye.